Election 1988, the 51st presidential election. Incumbent President Ronald Reagan was ineligible to seek a third term. In all respects, his presidency was quite strong. The only real blemish on it was the Iran-Contra affair, which was the US government trading arms for hostages in Iran and funding a rebel group in Nicaragua known as the Contras. President Reagan claimed he had no involvement in the affair, but these claims were disputed, especially at the time. Despite the strong economy and military prevalence, many people in the nation began to feel worried. One of these people was the governor of Massachusetts, Michael Stanley Dukakis, the son of Greek immigrants and a pretty prominent figure in the Democratic Party at this point. Dukakis asked himself, what are these people doing? Are these people actually being held accountable? Somebody needs to come in there and shake things up. So, Michael Dukakis announced that he would be running for president under the Democratic Party. He went up against such prominent names like future Vice President and then Senator from Tennessee, Al Gore, and future Vice President and then Senator from Delaware, Joe Biden. Biden was the frontrunner for a little while until it was revealed that he was plagiarizing speeches from Labor Party leader Neil Kinnock, stealing them almost word for word. That and some questions about his law degree ended up causing Biden to drop out of the campaign. This left room for Dukakis, who wanted to run a moral, upstanding campaign. In his words, no attacks. None of that. Yes, his campaign was the one that exposed Joe Biden for his wrongdoings, but he felt terrible about that. He wanted nothing more than to be an honest, upright politician, however few they may be. Dukakis was able to clinch the Democratic nomination and chose Lloyd Bentsen, a senator from Texas, to be his running mate, largely in part because he wanted to carry Texas. After all, it had gone for Reagan twice, went for Carter pretty narrowly, and was showing signs of being an unmovable red state. Over on the Republican side, Vice President George Herbert Walker Bush decided to give running for president another try. He had tried previously in 1980 but failed to get the nomination. This time, everyone thought that he would be the big guy. Iran-Contra seemed to bog him down, although on the Dan Rather show he ended up clearing his name and firing back at Rather in a very fiery and effective way. But he came in third in the Iowa caucus behind Kansas Senator Bob Dole and Pat Robertson, the televangelist. However, he was able to come back in New Hampshire, and then, it was no doubt, George Herbert Walker Bush would clearly become the Republican nominee, largely because people considered him to be the secondary Reagan, or Reagan's third term, as well as the fact that he was able to paint Bob Dole as, what he called him, Senator Straddle, being someone who was a flip-flopper, couldn't decide on any issue and tried to please and appease rather than lead, which is a reputation that would follow Senator Dole as he got the Republican nomination in 1996. In order to energize the base, George Bush chose Dan Quayle to be his running mate. Dan Quayle was a young senator from Indiana, and a lot of people thought that this was a very strange choice given his youth and his tendency to stumble over his words. Nevertheless, George Bush stood by his decision. So now it was Bush versus Dukakis. At first, it was actually Dukakis that was in the lead, but when questions about his mental health arose, they came shooting sharply down. Word had it that he got super depressed after his very first loss in the gubernatorial election, and he could not recover for a while. However, the Dukakis campaign refused to accept this, and went hard on the defense. But they did not go on the attack. Dukakis would not let anybody go against George Bush. They had a whole bunch of attack ads lined up, but Dukakis said, I do not want to see any of these on TV. Meanwhile, George Bush was touting himself as a big hero while using his campaign leader, Lee Atwater, to paint Dukakis as a know-nothing, spineless liberal. Which, keep in mind, in the days of Reagan, liberal was almost seen as a dirty word. This is not something you wanted to be called because it conflicted with the popular president's agenda. Another thing that really helped George Bush was his military record. He was the youngest pilot in the Air Force, and he actually got shot out of a plane. So, Dukakis thought, I need to go ahead and counteract this. He was in a plane, I'll be in a tank. And, well, let's just say he tanked. When visiting a tank factory in Michigan, the infamous Dukakis in tank picture showed up. He looked ridiculous, and the media had a field day. They kept asking themselves, is this really the kind of guy we want to be our president? A guy who looks like this when riding in a tank? He doesn't look like a leader. He doesn't look strong. And this weakness especially showed when the Willie Horton ad came out. While Bush himself did not push this ad, nor did his campaign sponsor it, they did capitalize on the news. While he was governor, Michael Dukakis passed the weekend prison pass system. Basically, if you were doing well in prison, you would be able to go out for the week, basically weekend parole. Well, Willie Horton ended up getting one of these, and he ended up raping a woman, killing her, and her boyfriend. The only punishment he got, because there was no death penalty in Massachusetts, was that he got his pass revoked. Naturally, this painted Dukakis in a very bad light. So, they prepared for an attack. They knew it was coming, especially with the upcoming presidential debate. His response to the inevitable question of why do you not favor the death penalty was supposed to be, I know what it's like. When I was younger, my brother was killed by a hit-and-run driver, and my father was robbed and tied up, and his store was completely robbed. I've been there. I know the pain, but I do not see substantial evidence to show that it's a deterrent, nor do I think it's a reasonable human option. That was supposed to be his reaction. But maybe because he wasn't ready to be on stage, or maybe because he was surprised that this was the very first question asked, if your wife Kitty Dukakis were raped and murdered, would you favor an irrevocable death penalty for the killer? And Dukakis just said, no, I don't see it as a deterrent, losing all sense of emotion that he had. Everybody knew, on both campaigns, Dukakis had lost. Especially because Bush was able to sweep in and give a much better answer. Even Dan Quayle's poor performance against Lloyd Bentsen in the vice presidential debates was not enough to stop George Bush. Dukakis had dug himself in a hole, and Bush was aligned with Reagan. Therefore, he was considered the favorite to win. Sure enough, on election night, he won 40 out of the 50 states. George Bush won 426 electoral votes. Meanwhile, Michael Dukakis only ended up winning 112/111. There was a faithless elector in West Virginia, but I tend to not count those. Basically, if you were a solid blue state, you would vote for Dukakis, with the exception of Iowa because of the farming crisis that was happening there. Two states, Washington and Oregon, were vastly turning blue at this point. They had previously been blue-leaning swing states, but now it was going full force. Although, it is important to note that these two, especially Washington, were quite close. Speaking of close states, I feel that it's also important to emphasize that major players like Illinois or Pennsylvania were very close as well. Still, had Dukakis won those, it wouldn't have been as much of a blowout, but he still would have lost. There was just no way for him to win. George Bush was seen as presidential, while Michael Dukakis was just seen as filler. Reagan's presidency, as well as somewhat George Bush's military service, were also big factors. To this day, this is the last time that the states of California, Illinois, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, Connecticut, Vermont, and Maine at large have voted for a Republican candidate. This was also the last time until 2016, when Michigan and Pennsylvania voted for a Republican candidate, which of course they ended up breaking then for Donald Trump. And that, my friends, is the election of 1988, Bush versus Dukakis.